Good morning and welcome to session 3 of Strategizing Through a Long-Term Crisis. We are pleased to be able to invite back Nico Chin for part 3 of this series. She is the owner of Up With Community and has been sharing her expertise with us through a framework that she developed kind of at the beginning of COVID and is helping us to kind of integrate how are we thinking individually as strategic thinkers, how are we showing up in this moment of crisis and in future crises to be strategic thinkers and leaders, and then how can we really leverage our expertise and comfort levels within our organization. And I am also going to share the link to the PowerPoint that we'll be working from in the chat. And I think there will be a few tools that Nico will share that we can share out in the chat as well. So Nico, I will let you take it away.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. And the way I'm thinking about this today, Brianne, is if we can invite a little bit more dialogue. It
Absolutely.
looks like we've got a decent number of folks for that. I know we're still expecting a few more folks. So I'm going to be encouraging folks to come off mute, put on your camera if you'd like to talk. Because I'd like this to really be a chance for us to start to weave the different pieces together. And so if we want to go to the next slide. Beautiful. So today we're really going to focus on how do we connect the altitudes in your organization? How do you weave together the different insights of seeing the short, the medium, and the long term, seeing the big picture, seeing that intermediate picture, and being in the day-to-day. And we're going to use some of the suggestions that came out of your session last week as a jumping off point for today. So we're going to look at recommendations for how you can personally connect into other altitudes. And then we're going to look at some tools that will help you do that in your organization. And we'll close with a question that came up in our very first session around the connection between racial justice and the fight for Black lives and the fight against COVID-19. In the chat just now, Brianne put a link to the PowerPoint that we're going to be using, and I'm loving seeing folks open it up. This is great. In this PowerPoint, I've put quite a few links for you. So I wanted you to have this PowerPoint from the start to take home. If you want to follow along on your desktop or laptop while we're moving through, that's great. If you're not on a desktop, you won't be missing anything. So don't worry about it. You don't need this right now, but I know Brianne will send it out in the notes after this call because she is awesome like that. So any questions from anybody about what we're going to be doing today? All right. I am an active chat user, so feel free to use the chat. And if you see anything coming in that you want me to see, Brianne, just feel free to jump in. So we can, if somebody needs to slow me down or raise a hand, Brianne will just pause.
I'll be the voice of the chatters because I think they're used to maybe having their video off or aren't expecting to have their video on today. So we want to give people the grace to have a no video day if they want. So
yeah, definitely. Just an invitation. So let's go to the next slide. And let's do a check-in on Color Brave Space. So this is a set of invitations that now you're seeing for the third time in a row. I want to see like which of these elements of Color Brave Space have felt resonant with you. Are there any that haven't resonated? I'd love to just see if anyone wants to share. Any elements of the Color Brave Space that have felt relevant, any that have felt off or less useful in this moment?
I'll just chime in while people are thinking to say throughout community circles, we've had so much discussion around the power of relationships and really prioritizing and centering our convenings around building relationships. And I think that what Color Brave Space does, at least for me, is help us think about what it means to put relationships first as well. I know that's kind of the first bullet point, but I can be a challenger too. So I like the creating space for multiple truths and norms, and how that challenges me as well. And, that kindness and bravery doesn't mean that you can't challenge. It's just really paying attention to those power dynamics, and making sure that you're doing it with that relationships first kind of attitude. So that's, at least for me, been showing up quite a bit. And I see Denise says, I've been focusing on look for learning and working to listen to many voices. So that's
I
something we've been hearing as well.
I think look for learning is the sleeper hardest one to do. I think what I have been experiencing in this COVID-19 moment, particularly in conversations on racial justice, is there's a lot of intention for learning and reversion to telling people about themselves rather than starting with one's own learning, rather than inviting people into an authentic learning relationship with each other. And what's so hard about this moment is a lot of the habits that we're trying to undo when we think about equity, when we think about racial justice, a lot of the habits of exclusion, of exploitation, of seeking power over, are the very habits we can go to in a crisis because we feel scared, because we feel threatened. And so it takes even more rest, reflection, and intention to not bite the hook and take the bait of a power over move, of telling someone about themselves to actually say, here's what I'm learning. What could you learn? Yeah. Anything else before we move on? All right. Well, I touch in with these commitments at least 2 or 3 times a day in my work. And I always find something new to check out. So I encourage you to check out Equity Matters, the folks that created this framework. So we'll go to the next slide. Now, I loved the notes that Brianne shared from your sessions last week. And some of those sessions may have felt exciting and energizing for folks. And for some, it may have been really hard. Like, it can be hard to look at yourself and say, okay, what altitude do I fly at, and what's working well and what's not working as well for me? And so much of what we have to do in times of crisis is figure out how to communicate quickly and effectively with people who don't think the same way that we do. And so this was really, thanks, Brianne, this was really the invitation for us to think about, what do we need to ask of others to work with us? And so in the next 3 slides, and the first one that's up is high altitude. And the next 3 slides, you're gonna see a quick note of the request, or at least how I understood it from last week's session. And then an offering that I'd like to invite folks who tend to fly at a high altitude to think about as you think about how to connect across altitudes. And I encourage these invitations with a lot of compassion and grace. This isn't a you must do this, but this is here are some patterns and habits I've seen emerge for folks that fly at this altitude. So let's start with our folks who tend to be at that visionary level, who are seeing the forest, who are thinking about paradigms, who are thinking really big picture. And I just thought there was a great request that came out of that conversation, which was, how can others in the mid-level and day-to-day tasks start with the big picture, or contextualize their needs within a big picture to help folks who fly at this altitude understand them? I think that's absolutely spot on. I think that's a great request. And in order for that request of others to have the impact I think we're seeking, that information that mid-level and day-to-day task level folks are sharing has to have a place to land. And one of the pitfalls that I've seen for high altitude leaders and thinkers is they're so high level They actually haven't built the systems in their own trackers, in their weekly work plan, in their quarterly benchmarks, just for themselves, to keep track of what mid-level and ground level folks are saying to them. And so then what happens is mid-level and ground level folks create outside structures for managing that information. But when they're not being effectively internalized by folks who fly at that high altitude, the dots aren't connected. Stuff falls through the cracks. And that's when we see waste, frustration. And what I see most often is really disappointed, missed expectations that lead to a lack of trust.
Mm.
And instead of naming that lack of trust, we tend to just shore up and reinforce that person's ability not to have to think strategically at all the levels. So the link in here, vision, assessment, strategy, and tactics, is just an offering of one simple way to organize information that people at other levels of the altitude are giving you, and almost keep it like a scratch pad, right? The vision may be the easiest piece for you to fill in, and then you're filling in the assessments and strategies and tactics and maybe shifting them once a month. What are my people telling me? What are my teams? What are the relationships that I'm being offered in the world offering to me that I can continue to think about? Any thoughts or reactions or questions on this altitude, either from people who fly at this altitude or thinking about how to navigate with other folks at this altitude?
One thing I did want to bring up from last week was that we had a board member, and I can't see if he's with us today, but I thought that was a really interesting opportunity to hear kind of from the board perspective, where in organizations it feels like this is the appropriate level for board members to be flying, and knowing that some board members are coming into that role maybe being a 10,000 footer naturally, and maybe within their own organizations, that might be where you might see people, we joke and say counting paper clips within an organization and kind of getting outside of that big picture governance role. So I just thought that was really neat that that's where the board member saw themselves in this session, and then that they were able to kind of, I don't know, speak for, not speak for all board members, but really kind of take that on. So can you speak, or if anybody else wants to add in the chat box, how you do see the interplay with this working out in your organizations, or even that communication between the board and staff or relationships?
My simple answer here, Brienne, is we created the strategic thinking framework for a board. That was the original impetus, right? Because what we do with boards is often the same thing we do with high altitude thinkers in our organization, is we throw a bunch of information at them and expect them to organize it or hold on to it in between quarterly board meetings. And so what I like to do is actually create like a vast dashboard that's 1 or 2 pages. Here's our vision. Here are the big level assessments you want to know before you go into decision making. Here are those strategies and tactics one more time. And again, just give them that high level piece that they can just take with them from board meeting to board meeting, that gets changed in between board meetings, but actually allows for folks to hold the whole and connect the dots. Anything else before we move to the next altitude? All right, we'll keep going. We'll keep going. So the next altitude is our mid-level folks. And this is where I tend to live. So let's call these I statements on this slide.
Same. This was our most populous area as well from everybody. And maybe it's saying something too, that everybody who kind of self-selected into joining us today, the majority of us are maybe frustrated because we're stuck in the middle.
Yeah. And again, I just thought this was like a spot on request. I'm not kidding. Like, I kind of got goosebumps reading the notes from last week's session, because I was like, these are such insightful requests. These are great. But what I really heard was this request of be patient with us. Sometimes we can get burnout. We can get stuck in the weeds, right? when I sit with folks that have either pressures towards this dynamic or tendencies towards this dynamic, I understand deeply within my own journey. And one piece that I find useful in the mix of all of this is grounding in power and assertiveness. And what I mean by assertiveness is not the patriarchal version of assertiveness that says you should speak up and talk for yourself. Like, that's not what we're talking about. And I'm so glad this is being recorded so that you have that impression for posterity. No, I don't mean assertiveness of like talk up for yourself. What I actually mean is the independence to own your power in relationship to others. And so the two links that I'm offering here, one is a lovely handout about confusions of power that can happen in organizations from the Social Transformation Project. And I'm running into a lot of organizations that I need to share this with. So that's why I thought, let's just put it in here because I'm sure somebody will find it useful, right? We've been taught sometimes that power is always power over. It's always someone seeking to control us or us seeking to control someone else. And that's just a false stance. That's a false stance that supports oppression, that maintains inequity, and keeps us from achieving our missions. The confusions of power piece that's linked to here really gets at four versions of that dance, where we're seeking power over or power under. The second link to the assertiveness workbook is an invitation to step into our ability to nurture power with. How do we have a strong viewpoint? How do we get what we know is needed for the mission? And not do it by circumnavigating issues of power or tamping down our own voice. You know, there's a beautiful podcast with a woman who I think is like one of the first billionaires, one of the first African-American billionaires in the US. And she's a woman. And she talks about how for so long her strategy to success for like the first 20 years of her career had been to seem less smart. And it was finally having that next generation of BIPOC women come into her field of vision and invite her to still be successful, but also own her smarts, that she found some liberation. And what I want to say is we never think about assertiveness outside of structural racism, right? So this recommendation is not for an organization where there is structural racism and structural oppression tamping down people's voices. That's a different PowerPoint. That's a different conversation, right? And I'm always happy to talk to people about that, right? But in a system where you are being invited to access your power, you are being invited not to burn out, that invitation is only going to go so far as you are able to meet it. And that's why I wanted to put this out here, right? So not to ignore or gaslight structural racism and structural oppressions that drive blocking our power, but to really see where there are clear pathways to accessing our power and take advantage. Thoughts and reactions?
Yeah, I'd really invite those two or the mid-level folks. I'm saying two because that was the number we gave to the breakouts. But those mid-level folks to pop something in the chat. Over the past week, what have you been thinking about or reflecting on after our conversation and our time together? Have you been noticing maybe in some conversations within your organization how your mid-level mindset is showing up? Feel free to pop something in the chat and we can come back to some of these comments as well. Maybe everybody else is like me and needs their coffee this morning.
That's okay. We can keep going if there's no immediate thoughts here. And we're actually going to get to a couple of tools that can help with structural barriers to power in a minute. And the confusions about power handout really talks about that. It essentially is, where are we structurally blocking power? Yeah. Okay, we'll keep going. And if more questions come up later, we can definitely definitely do that. Okay. So our final slide is for our ground level folks, for folks who are really in that implementation and day to day. So what I really appreciated in the request that came out of this small group was a desire for other folks to be clear about their expectations, right? It's an understanding that you want to connect into those expectations, but that you also need space to iterate the how. And I really liked that, because this is the insight, this is the simple insight of the best manager trainings that I've ever been a part of, right? Like literally, this is like, if there's a Bible verse in good management, it is get clear on expectations, give folks the room to figure out the how with skills and capacity and resources, right? And it's the skills, capacity, and resources that sometimes we give short shrift to. So it's not fair or just to anyone to set up expectations that people don't reasonably have capacity, resources, and support for, right? So we have to make sure that these are aligned, right? And then we have to make sure we can change the plan as we're learning from what's happening in the day-to-day implementation, right? A lot of times at the end of a project that has failed or just not reached its full potential, right? I'll hear a lot of high-level managers that will say, oh, this failed, like, oh, we couldn't have seen it coming. We just, here we are, but we're going to learn. And if I talk one-on-one to some of the folks that were implementing that plan, they actually knew way sooner what was off, right? And so in the same way, we want to offer this request to say, like, give us space to iterate the how. We really want to make sure that there are feedback loops so that information that's really needed for the success of the project is coming from folks that are in that implementation and day to day, right? And I'm going to put in another link here because I've been mulling over what the best link is, and I think I just figured out what it is as I was explaining this slide. So I'll add it into the slide after this.
Sure. Yeah. You can, if you know what it is, feel free to pop it in the chat. I
Yeah.
loved some of what this group said. Just we may spend time in the weeds because we're good at it, but that doesn't mean we don't want to smell the roses and help imagine the garden. So
That's exactly right.
I'm such an analogy person, so I really appreciated that when we think about kind of this strategy garden that we're creating. Who are the different gardeners and pruners and things. So
Yeah, and I think we often this is where internalized oppression, classism, sexism, ageism, ableism really plays out. Because a lot of our nonprofit structures have baked into them this idea that day-to-day implementers are less than. They're iced out of strategy conversations, they're iced out of decision-making structures, and really conceptualized in the very oppressive ways that we're actually trying to change. And so part of the invitation of this slide is to give room and life to that smelling of the roses, and thinking critically about what communication needs to happen between people. And I am finding that slide. And what I call this is, instead of thinking at it as I get the plan and I go do it, I like to think about folks in that day-to-day implementation stage as being about being our excellent experimenters. So I like to envision these folks as experimenters, right? And so their voice will be some of the most important voices I will listen to when I'm coming in to do a change project. And I've just added the link into the slide. So if you refresh, it should show up. But we have some tools. We have some tools in our toolkit that's on our website that are about, here's what we would use to experiment well together.
That's really cool.
Build really good experiments. And at a time of crisis, you want to think about your day-to-day work and your ground level work as the most valuable gold. And how do you honor that in your communications? I'm seeing some stuff coming on the chat.
Yeah, I know. So Sally is talking about the challenges with taking action on racial equity. Action plans have to be resourced and staffed for them to be successful. So we have a really strong track record in Des Moines of coming up with plans, and then not having necessarily the resource to implement them. So
Yeah.
I think maybe that's something Sally is alluding to. And
Yeah.
then I did see a private chat from one of our middle folks who said that dipping into a lower altitude can be comforting, especially during periods of burnout, but then it's easy to get stuck there. And I think that's also maybe where that resentment phase can come in, when you maybe are not able to fly at the altitude that you feel like you can best be contributing to your organization.
Yeah, and I want to share two things to Sally's point and then get to Matthew's point in the chat as well. So to Sally's point, I often see a few drivers behind why people don't resource these plans. Here's the first one. When people treat racial justice as a set of beliefs rather than the truth about how the world works, they actually under-resource the change. So when you think about a set of beliefs, you're like, oh, I just got to read a book and talk about it a few times, and then I'll get it, and then I'll go do it, right? So we create these outcomes-based plans, and we assume that our typical ways of learning will make them happen, right? Because we fundamentally misunderstood that the work of racial justice isn't about just getting a set of beliefs. It's about actually restructuring how we think about power in our decision-making processes, right? This is intimately linked to a second driver of why I see these plans under-resourced, right? If you think about racial justice as an optional set of beliefs, then you can choose when and how to engage in it. If you actually understand that racial injustices are the operating system of our economy, our politics, and our society, you can't possibly fathom running your business or your nonprofit without understanding it deeply. And without having that understanding driving all of your strategy decisions. And I was on a call this morning with a tech company, a tech startup out of Boston. And you know, one of the conversations that I said to them was, if you think being an excellent tech company can happen in COVID-19 with everything that you see going on, without having to understand power, good luck. The reading on the wall is that what is driving so much of what is hurting our communities right now are these injustices. And to think, to have the hubris that you do not need to understand power in order to continue running your organization, it borders on foolishness in this day and age, right? And so when we understand it as this core component of strategy and mission achievement, we resource it well. The third driver of poorly resourced plans, in my opinion, is hidden white supremacy culture in that moment. So we're saying we want to do racial justice. We're building this beautiful aspirational plan, but we're actually going about it from a white supremacy culture perspective. We're saying bigger is better. We're saying it's going to be linear. And we value doing over being. So it has to happen right away. What I have seen is quality racial justice plans are incremental, and they're designed in a way that the first part starts with awareness building that can feel like it's not action, but if it's done well and if it's done with a great practitioner, it ends up changing everything in a matter of weeks. But it looks different than a bigger, better, action-oriented plan that actually skips the step of awareness building and that adult learning cycle that we talked about in the first session. Anything else in relationship to Sally's point before I move to Matthew's point? So Matthew, I'm curious if you wanted to come off of mute and just say a little bit more about where this curiosity comes from.
Hi, sure. For me, I am the artistic director of a theater company here in town, and there can be sort of a classic, in our structure, we have a resident artist company and a board of directors. The resident artist company are really boots on the ground. Board of directors are really the governance level. We're like a lot of companies, very leanly staffed, so we lean on that RAC and our volunteers to really get things done. So the classic example for us was we had a strategic decision to make about the venue in which we would perform. And it just became very clear that what we needed to do was have one big meeting with everybody in the room, because it's very easy at a governance level to say, hey, this is our strategic decision, without understanding what impact that's going to have on the people who actually have to carry out that decision. And so that experience really got me thinking about trying to make sure that I'm moving decision-making closer to the pain points in the organization, meaning the place where the rubber's actually going to meet the road. That we have to have that input, because I think it's very easy to chart this grand course and say, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. But in fact, the people who actually then have to do that would, as you were mentioning before, would look at the plan and go, there's no way on God's green earth that we're actually going to be able to do this.
Yeah. Matthew, I love that story. I'm so glad that you shared that. I'm sorry that it had to be hard, but I really think there's a lot of value to the story that you just shared. And the thing I just want to yes and is, one of the most common questions that will come up for me in a client engagement, where I can see a disconnection between who is allowed to strategic plan and strategic think and who isn't within the power dynamics of an organization, is when I say to someone in a decision-making role, and I say, do you know what XYZ person who implements that plan thinks in the last 3 months? Sometimes it's just about anything or specific to the topic we're discussing. And the first thing I will hear, and I want to say 75% of the situation, is I have no idea. That person may be 2 to 3 layers of hierarchy removed from them. Mm-hmm. And one of the first things I'll have to do is work with a leadership team to reframe how they think about their responsibilities. We have come to think in a lot of nonprofits that once you get to a certain level of decision making, it's not your job to know what those other people over there are thinking, right? When actually, to lead in crisis and to run an effective organization, those are the people that you should be talking to, or at least getting information from, right? Because in 600-person organizations, 100-person organizations, we can't all be talking one-on-one. So you have to create systems where that information is flowing effectively and in a relational way. But that's actually the starting place. And so with one leader that I was talking to yesterday, I had invited her about 3 weeks ago. We're working on matching intent and impact. And so I invited her in more of her team meetings to say, here's how this is landing for me. How is this landing for you? Or how could I show up differently to support you in your work? Or what would you like me to know about your work, right? So she's at the top and she's engaging in this crisis moment with people at lots of different hierarchies. And I checked in with her 3 weeks after the fact. And this is someone who's very committed to the change, very committed to listening. And in the hustle and bustle of the last 3 weeks, she's forgotten. And I offered her 2 thoughts. One, the forgetting could simply just be, you just forgot. Like, she's in a lot of tough stuff right now. So we'll just have some compassion and we'll say, you can get back on the horse. And I said, I want you to write your questions down in your own voice on a Post-it and put it on your computer. When we change it from, oh, I'll do this when I can, to this is one of the most important things I can do as a leader, that's when we'll see the habit change, right? But the second thing I offered her is, I will meet leaders who say they want the change, say they want to connect, but they have some part of themselves that they really haven't reckoned with that's afraid to hear the answer. And so they have built decision-making processes that seem inclusive and collaborative, but people in the day-to-day know they're not. That have a lot of lip service to, oh yes, our frontline workers, oh yes, our people, like we want to take their lead, but then we all know that's not happening in action. What I invite those leaders to do is actually step back from the let's create another system for feedback for a minute, and let's be curious if there's a part of us that's afraid of the answers and that needs to shift the energy.
Nico, I love the questions that you suggested there, and I don't know if everybody on the call knows, but I come from a journalism background, so I love questions as well. And kind of the favorite one that I always use at the end of an interview is there something that I didn't ask that you think is important, or what didn't I ask that you think is important? And more often than not, we have another hour conversation after that that gets more closely to the heart of what needed to be said or asked. And so I think that's another tool maybe for leaders, is having these questions and then knowing you might not even be asking the right questions to get the kind of feedback that your teams want to give you, or that there isn't a channel for. So
Yeah. Well, and I saw Ryan's comment in the chat,
Mhm.
and I think that's a great place to transition to our next slide. And folks, I added in another tool to this slide number 7, based on what I saw in Ryan's question. So folks, when you look at that PowerPoint now or at it after this call, you'll see another tool added in that I'm going to reference, but that's not showing up in our Zoom. So Ryan, this is a great question. And I'm going to say a couple other things and then circle back to you. So the first 3 bullet points on this slide are, when I looked at the feedback from each of the altitudes on what would be most useful for you to work on, we never want to stay just in the interpersonal level, right? That just is white supremacy culture again, saying you need to make yourself perfect as an individual. We're stepping back from that, right? But what we really want to integrate is an understanding of what can I do as an individual and what needs to shift in the system. And so the first 3 slides that we did on each of the altitudes would be really incomplete and a disservice if they weren't matched with what are some tools that can help shift your system. And so the first 3 things here, seek power with other altitudes, feedback toolkit, and managing triggers toolkit. These are 3 entry points that I often offer to teams of people to think about, how could we shift some ways that we're engaging with each other, right? So seeking power with other altitudes is, how can we be curious about how we have old habits of power that aren't serving us? The feedback toolkit is, a lot of organizations have a very poor understanding of how to use feedback. And that's the number 1 Achilles heel I will see, especially in a crisis. Were you going to say something, Brianne?
That one, when I'm clicking on it, it is restricted privileges. So we can just update that when we send out the PowerPoint afterwards.
Yeah.
'Cause I think that will be something people are interested in.
Great. Yeah, sorry about that. I was trying to get all of the different ones together. So the other piece about managing triggers is, we can often be in a situation where we are all feeling in crisis and acting that out on each other. And I'll talk about needing to help the system cool off, help the system cool down, so that we can allow respect and allow that power width to come forth. And this is a toolkit that I have found incredibly useful in that process. And I'm going to go ahead and fix that link right now, just so that if folks are trying to see it, they'll get a chance to see it.
Sure. And I can pop that managing triggers one into the chat while you're doing that too.
Great. So now to get to Ryan's question. So Ryan, one of the things that I am also suggesting was this: how do you do regular altitude check-ins, right? So one is to have stronger decision-making protocols. And so the link that you'll see here, the primer on how to make strong decisions together, offers 4 or 5 different pathways to strong decision making. And so one thing would be to actually look at how your team has been making decisions through the lens of that tool and see if there are some pathways you haven't tried out or tried on yet, and actually honor if there's some that you're doing really well. The other piece that I find really useful, and I'll pop this in the chat since it's not showing up quite yet in the in the PowerPoint on the Zoom, is this tool about purpose outcome process. It's called POP. It's by the same group, Social Transformation Project. And what POP allows us to do is make sure that, and this is especially helpful for our day-to-day implementers, is to make sure that we're always spot checking that our process decisions and choices stay aligned to purpose and outcome, right? So there are so many examples where we think we've got the same purpose and outcome, but we actually are trying to solve different problems. And so then we start to fight about process. And doing POP is a simple way of also doing an altitude check-in, because you're checking in at that high level purpose, at those mid-level outcomes, and then at that day-to-day implementation process. So just using POP and check-ins and using POP to navigate conflict can be really helpful. So for example, if I'm a manager communicating with someone who I supervise about a project, I may just say to them, here's the purpose, here's the outcome. What questions or feedback do you have about that? Or I may say, can we co-create the purpose and outcomes? Make sure we're aligned on that. And then say, can you come back to me with a process? Or can we co-create a process? Or what questions do you have to help set up that process, right? Just helps us make sure that we're not missing those things. When I'm in a conversation with colleagues where someone is saying, I think that we should open up this training to 50 people because we need to raise money to have more people know about us. And you've got another person saying, we need to open this training up to only 10 people because the quality of learning will be undermined. Those are actually 2 different purposes. One is about fundraising and one is about learner outcomes. And so what I'll often say to people is stop the fight about how many people should be in the training and actually build plans for those 2 different purposes. And then you'll know how big the training should be. Thoughts and reactions?
And I'm going in, I'm going to
That was
pop in.
very,
Oh, go ahead.
sorry, I'm going to honor Nico's, sorry, I just intended to honor Nico's request that we pop up on camera from time to time. And since I asked that question, you directed the response to me, I got a lot out of that, Nico. So thank you very much.
Oh, good. Thanks, Ryan. Any follow-ups or anything?
No, I thought it got exactly to the heart of kind of the practical matter of me implementing this potentially with my supervisor and with our team, our charitable giving team. And it just fit very neatly into, or I can see rather how it would fit very neatly into our existing metrics to evaluate check-ins and quarterly touch bases and such. So thank you.
Great. And I realized I put the right POP link into the chat now. So that last link I just put in is the right link.
Perfect. Yeah. And I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, when we set our agendas for meetings, even having POP at the top of the agenda, like something as simple as that, taking it out of kind of this framework and putting it into an agenda for an active meeting, it's a good callback maybe to align so that you're not getting completely off course in the midst of those discussions. So
that's exactly right. That's exactly right. Anything else on these tools before I move to talking about racial justice and COVID-19?
I think I think we could spend a whole session on any of these tools. So I'm excited to dig more deeply into them. And they'll probably, they'll come up now and again in the future when we're hosting some of these sessions. So thanks.
Great. So I wanted to revisit the conversation that we had in session 1 because it just got cut short for time on where might we be conflating the crisis of COVID-19 with the structural inequity of racism. And I just wanted to offer a little bit more food for thought for this, right? One of the ways that I distinguish between COVID-19 and racial injustice is that COVID-19 is a crisis. Part of that crisis is a manifestation of racial injustice. Racial injustice is a generational structural iniquity that has multiple crises within it. Some of those crises are like super long term, such that the word crisis doesn't even start to capture them anymore. It becomes into this realm of like tragedy, injustice, immorality. And we have to talk about it in those terms in order to address a lot of what we've talked about on this call, particularly about the appropriate resourcing of plans. And I think what really resonated with me with the conversation from the first session is when you equate racial injustice to COVID-19 as a crisis, what you're actually doing, at least for somebody like me, the impact that has is to like downgrade racial injustice in some ways, is to really invisibilize a lot of the moral aspects of it. And so I sat with, what are some of the ways that I think about these things differently? And these 4 bullet points were the ones that first came to my mind. Thinking about racial injustice as made by people and COVID-19 being about biology. Thinking about racial injustice as structural systems of power and COVID-19 being about public health. Now, do structural systems of power influence COVID-19? Of course, right? But these are actually different altitudes and different magnitudes of issue, right? The time horizons that both of these things deal with are very different. And where these live are different, right? I can look at COVID-19 under a microscope. I have to use very different tools to make the implicit drivers that are some of the most endemic and most, I will use the word sinister, drivers of racial injustice. To make those bear, it just takes a different engagement. Just want to hear thoughts and reactions to putting this out here. If this resonates, if this doesn't resonate, and any additions that folks want to add into this conversation or questions.
I see Katie has a question. So Katie,
Katie!
feel free to unmute or type it in the chat box. We'd love to hear from you.
Thank you. I hope my microphone's working okay. I'm sitting outside. It's a bit loud with airplanes. My question, I don't know if it's really a question or more of a food for thought. I think it's really interesting to see the delineation between COVID-19 and racial injustice. And I'm kind of wondering or reflecting on this era of post-truth that we live in, where people kind of elect to believe what they want to believe. And I didn't know if you had any thoughts, and maybe that's too meta for this conversation, but when we're working with folks on trying to get them, for example, when I'm working to try to get fellow white folks to believe me that racial injustice is something that exists and that is a prevalent inequity, I'm finding that there are similar barriers to something I never thought I would think there was barriers to, with this biological phenomenon that's happening around the world. Folks really, there is a vast group of people who don't really believe in it. I don't know if you have any thoughts or correlation between that.
Yeah. Katie, I don't know if you can tell. I think there's very little that feels too meta to me. So I welcome it, but we're also going to bring it down into the practical too. Tell me if I'm misunderstanding what you're saying. So I hear a framing of this as we're living in a quote unquote post-truth world and people are electing to believe what they want to believe. What I hear in that way of framing is I don't call that framing untrue. I just ask if it's useful to me. Because what that framing does is for me, it overemphasizes the individual and the interpersonal. It overemphasizes people's agency from what I believe to be true about our brains and our bodies and how we actually come to the ideas we have. At any given time, your implicit drivers are 85% of your brain function right now. So right now, only 15% of your brain is having the thoughts that you're having about this conversation, right? And so what I see happening in the world today is I don't call 80% of my family having voted for Trump, my extended family having voted for Trump, which is a whole other thing, that they elected to do that and are ignoring truth. The analysis I choose is to actually have a structural analysis of power that embeds those choices in a system that was set up for them to believe that way. And I do it in this way. That doesn't take away the individual's responsibility for choices and actions that they're making right now. But it doesn't overemphasize the individual in a way to allow the structure to stay invisible. So what we want to do when we're thinking about racial injustice is tie personal, interpersonal, organizational, and cultural, systemic all together. And so when I look at people who are ignoring the truth, I don't say to myself, they're willfully ignoring the truth. I say to myself, oh, they don't understand power.
I guess that kind of ties Nico and Katie. You can feel free to chime in here. I guess what I'm hearing from her question too might be, how do we start to strategize around a problem when we can't seem to agree that there is a problem or what the problem is?
I'm going to tell you my favorite analogy, Brienne. Here's where we start from. Here's the analogy that I came to about 18 months ago. I felt like I was seeing a bunch of organizations hand the knife to a surgeon who didn't know anything about hemoglobin. Okay? So imagine you're going in, let's say to get heart surgery, right? You're not going to ask your surgeon, do you know about hemoglobin before they do the surgery, right? Do you know about those little things that carry oxygen in my blood? But you're going to really want to make sure that your surgeon knows something about hemoglobin before they cut you open. Running an organization in the United States without understanding systems of racialized power is like doing surgery without understanding hemoglobin. It doesn't make sense. And so for me, I do not accept the premise of the question, should we or shouldn't we engage on racial justice? That's just no longer a useful place to start. For me, the starting place is, can you be an excellent organization that doesn't? And for me, the answer is no. And so when I have this conversation, the number one thing people will say to me is, but Nico, I'm not the one in charge. What do I do? And I say, we have to organize to stop giving the scalpel to people who don't know about hemoglobin. And this, I get a lot of pushback. So I'm working with an organization right now where the leadership really had a tough crisis and had to look at how they did not understand racial justice. Everyone got to the point of saying, we're going to do something about this, but they were holding two paradoxical thoughts. One was, they know we have to slow down in order to do this well. The other was the white supremacy culture driver of, we have to act right now. And so they're torn. And I invited the idea of the pause. Let us pause before making decisions. Let us pause before reenacting white supremacy culture. And let's do something different. And I got a massive pushback on that. Not from the top, right? So the people that were like, had done the harm were like, we'll pause. We don't want to do But the people who wanted the change were like, we don't want to pause. And I had to say to them, if you don't pause, you're just going to get more of the same. Like, I can't thread that needle, right? So we need to work with a sense of immediacy, but urgency will be a replication of the status quo of harm. I'll stop there. Anybody disagree with this? I'm happy to hear
I
it.
really like the differentiator between immediacy and urgency.
Mhm.
And I know that in our community, that is something that we're being challenged with as well. So
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that rings true and is relevant to me.
Yeah. And I think we're in a different, like, moment of reality right now in relationship to small p politics and big P politics. And one of the things that I believe to be true is you can vote for almost anyone and be a racial justice warrior. That I don't think that there's any side of the political spectrum that holds the truth for racial justice. And I think that there are starting points everywhere. And we have to be able to name that there is something very deeply broken about what's happening right now. And that is like overt white supremacy, overt suppression of truth, which is what your question was also getting to, Katie. And that's why I reject the premise of the question of, could this be true or could this not be true, right? And I'm writing my newsletter this morning. It's going to come out in a week or two. And I used a quote from James Baldwin that I think is a good place to pause here, which is said, we can disagree with each other and love each other, as long as our disagreement isn't based in my oppression and the denial of my humanity and right to exist.
Well, I think that is a really good kind of pause and an opportunity for us to maybe wrap up our time with you. And on behalf of the folks who have joined us today, thank you, Nico, for sharing all of these resources with us, your framework initially, and then also kind of walking us through this journey and giving us the opportunity to have a dialogue with you and how this can show up in our community, in our organization, and in ourselves. So thank you so much. I do want to just spend one more minute kind of as we're wrapping up to invite folks. We will be sending out a recap with this recording and kind of summarizing everything and some links to the resources, the PowerPoint that Nico shared. And then next week, we'll be back to our community circles and conversations, and we'll be talking about return to learn in our community, specifically as the topic. I know this is a challenge that as a community, we're all strategizing around what virtual learning is going to mean to our families, our organizations, et cetera. And so this will be an opportunity, and this is an HR issue for some organizations. So I'd invite you, if you're part of an organization that has been looking for or engaging in solutions around return to learn, to get in touch with me this week. And then we'll send out a new registration for our series that will extend from August until December of community circles and conversations, and kind of how we're restructuring that. So I will have that as part of the follow-up email for this session as well for everyone who's registered. And you can expect to hear from me before the end of the week on that. So thank you so much for everybody who has been here. I'm going to hang on with Nico, and if you have questions for her or ideas that we can implement as part of our future community circles, please let me know. But in the meantime, go ahead and have a wonderful week, and look forward to talking with you again.